Thank you, Russell, for inviting me to this conference, and for my Decoding Dyslexia colleagues who are here in attendance from various parts of the country. And also, we're just a little in awe with all the researchers here, because you really are our rock stars. We lean on your research daily, and we read it, and we take it to our schools, and sometimes it's not met with the response that you would hope and that we would hope, and that's really the crux of what Decoding Dyslexia, what stirred our movement to begin. For those of you who may not be aware, Congressman Lamar Smith and his staff dedicate countless hours to this issue, and we are grateful. What is Decoding Dyslexia? We are nothing like a PTA. We are a network of action-orientated parents in all 50 states. Texas alone has 10 regional Decoding Dyslexia chapters, and we are all parents. We reach out regularly, daily, on social media throughout the country and within our own states, hearing stories and sharing information and strategies on how to make your research actually work in the classroom. Our mission is to educate, advocate, and legislate. And I'll add one more. It's to collaborate with you and others. Your research is nothing short of life-changing, yet remains in many schools mere suggestions. Early on, we recognized the disconnect between best practice, policy, and implementation. And Decoding Dyslexia works tirelessly to bridge that gap. We want your work to find success in the classroom. Your success is our kids' success, and we look forward to working with you. So please reach out to us. We'll be here the whole conference, and we're honored to be part of this. And with that, I don't want to spend too much more time, but I have the honor and privilege to introduce a very special person. Jack Fletcher. He's got a lot of initials after his name. He's
It's a living.
the Hugh Roy and Lillian Krantz Cullen Distinguished University Professor, Chair, Department of Psychology, Interim Associate Vice President of Research Administration at the University of Houston, and I'm honored to meet him finally. He's helped us through 10 years of advocacy, and really what spurred my faith in research. We brought his book to our school campus when my son was first diagnosed with dyslexia 10 years ago. They were giving him reading recovery. So I don't know, that sends a cringe through my spine. We were able to work through some issues, and Jack has always been there supporting us when we needed it. So thank you, Jack. And
So what I was asked to do is to give an introduction to scientific research on dyslexia. And there's going to be something here that's going to make everybody mad at some point. That's intentional because there's a lot to be mad about. We've been doing this research for years. It has not been implemented in the school. Even though we have talked extensively about issues like early intervention, layered interventions, and so on, we have done a lousy job of translating it into school despite the best efforts of researchers and despite some fairly significant research funding in the area. And so I'm going to try and give you an idea about what we know about dyslexia. I'm going to thread carefully around the neuroscience areas because you have two people far more qualified than me who are going to talk about that later. But I want to just talk about simple things that involve what we know and what we don't know. The thing that we do know is that dyslexia is real. Parents commonly have the experience of going into the school and saying, I think my child has dyslexia, and the school says, we don't know what that is, or nobody knows what that is. And if you wonder why Decoding Dyslexia, for example, has gotten legislation passed in, I believe, 31 states, here it is. Dyslexia is real. People with dyslexia confuse people because they often have other problems like attention deficit disorder, a math problem, or written expression. And it's certainly not the only type of reading disability, but it is the most common. Many children who are at risk for dyslexia can be taught to read if they are identified early and they get, notice this key word, explicit. This is the most important word in my slides, explicit and comprehensive reading instruction, which means that they don't get worksheets and learn how to sound out words and things like that. They get a comprehensive, evidence-based reading program that allows the teacher to differentiate instruction in the classroom and then through supplemental interventions if they need it. And the reason for that is that if your approach is to try and take somebody with dyslexia, evaluate them, diagnose them, and then remediate the problem, which usually occurs at an average age of 10 years or older, it will be demonstrably ineffective. You will be able to maintain the child at a certain level, but you will not accelerate them on average to a level where they can read as well as their peers. And we know from neuroscience why that's the case. I'll come back to this issue because we know lots about brain function. We know lots about the malleability of the neural systems that support reading. And the key word is plasticity in development, because the only way that you can learn to read is for your brain to reorganize in order to support the task of reading, because reading is not an evolutionarily based skill. Instead, what we do is we take areas of the brain that are evolutionarily designed for language and for visual processing, and we reorganize them in a way that allows us to develop a reading brain. If you don't get the instruction that you need to develop a reading brain, you won't develop the neural network that you need, and a lot of kids are genetically programmed to have brains that are at risk that make this type of teaching really difficult, and that's when it turns into dyslexia. Things that we don't know. We do not know exactly how many people have dyslexia. We do not know the level of intensity that's required to remediate dyslexia, except that if we're talking about remediation, and I'm using this to contrast with early screening and early intervention, it needs to be a lot more intensive than 30 minutes of resource classes a day for the rest of your life. We do not know how dyslexia differs from other word-level disorders, sort of where to draw the line, except that there are a lot of kids out there who can't read words accurately and fluently. We certainly, clearly don't know how to scale effective identification and intervention and translate what's known from science. Even now, even though we in this room can all agree that early identification is really important, in the schools it's more of a slogan than a practice. We don't know how to use the research on brain function and heredity to identify and intervene with dyslexia, except that we know that people aren't born with dyslexia genes. They're born with genomic organizations that predispose them to have brains that lend themselves to dyslexia. And we especially do not know what to do with kids who are intractable, don't respond to intervention from an intense intervention viewpoint, but in particular from the viewpoint of accommodations and adjuncts that help people with intractable reading problems. We think we do, we prescribe them all the time, but we don't have any real evidence that these things actually work other than case descriptions and things of that sort. Part of the problem is that there still remain major misunderstandings about dyslexia. Misunderstandings about definition and prevalence, the role of IQ tests, the specificity of the disorder, what types of interventions are actually effective, methods of service delivery, and what it means to talk about the brain and heredity when you talk about dyslexia. I'm going to try and clear some of that up. This is going to make lots of you mad if some of you are not already mad. Dyslexia is the most common form of learning disability and the best understood. In the book that Robbi was talking about, the dyslexia chapter is twice as long as any other chapter, and in the second edition, which is coming out later this year, the dyslexia chapter is about 120 pages long. It's 50 pages longer than the math disability chapter, because there's so much research and we know so much from research about what to do about dyslexia. It's the largest group of children in special education. The President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education found that almost 2 out of 5, that it represents 2 out of every 5 children identified for special education. But we know that many children that are not identified for special education, like in Title I programs and programs like that, have word level problems. And it's addressed in IDEA. It's not true that IDEA doesn't address dyslexia. It doesn't use that word, but it does use a term called basic reading skills. And in many states, kids with dyslexia are actually served perhaps more effectively through 504 programs. This is the International Dyslexia Association of definition of dyslexia. It was adopted in 2002. It says that dyslexia is a learning disability that is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. People with dyslexia cannot read words or spell words in isolation. That's it. That is the key phenotypic characteristic of dyslexia, the inability to read and spell words in isolation. Once you move away from that, all the scientific information I'm going to give you has no meaning. When you have this problem, it creates a bottleneck. It is not a text level disorder, but it creates problems at the level of text, and it interferes with comprehension and writing. We know that there's a big role for phonological processing in dyslexia. Virtually everybody in this room has now heard of phonological awareness. And we know that this is unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities because there are lots of things that people with dyslexia are often good at doing, although that should not be the defining characteristic. And we also know that we have to tie the concept of dyslexia to the provision of effective classroom instruction because it makes no sense to talk about somebody as having dyslexia if we haven't had the opportunity to program the neural systems through effective instruction. And then we have secondary consequences in reading comprehension, lack of access to print. If you go through school and you can't access the words on the page, early in your development, you are hitting a spiral of poor reading that will accelerate throughout your entire life and interfere with your overall adaptation as a child and an adult because eventually it's going to affect your language development. So we have a lot of important research findings. The first is the one that I've emphasized, that dyslexia occurs primarily at the level of a single word and involves the ability to decode and spell words in isolation, not only accurately, which is a peculiarly English problem because we have such a corrupted language, but also fluently, because in languages where the relation of what words look like and what they sound like is more regular, like Spanish or Finnish or something of that sort, dyslexia is defined primarily as a reading fluency problem. You have to use a time test to detect it because accuracy is not the primary problem. But it leads to problems reading text, but it is not a text-level disability. We know that these problems are strongly associated with difficulties segmenting words and syllables into phonemes. In other words, the relation of what words look like and the relation of what words sound like. This is called the alphabetic principle. That print represents speech through the alphabet or some other visual symbol, regardless of the surface appearance of the word, the orthography. These squiggles represent internal segments of sound called phonemes, which is the smallest part of speech that makes a difference in the word. We learn to read by building upon our evolutionarily determined capacities for language. If learning to read was as natural as learning to talk, if it was evolutionarily based, what we would do is we would drop schools, stop funding them, buy pickup trucks, put seat belts in the back of the pickup trucks, and drive kids up and down the freeway to expose them to environmental print because that should be enough to activate the brain systems that are related to reading. But we know that doesn't work because everybody has to be taught the alphabetic principle in order to know not just what a word means, but what a word is, what it represents. So in learning to read, what the child has to do is to make explicit what is inherently and implicit understanding that words have internal structures that are linked to sounds. And they do that through phonological awareness, which is not perceptual processing, but a metacognitive, an overarching understanding of the internal structure of words. You develop that, you apply it to print, then words mean something. And I don't mean understanding, I mean you can actually recognize a word as a word. You can look at the squiggles here, they represent objects in your visual field, just like my hand does. And we have a brain area for that gets programmed for reading that John Gabriele and Guinevere Eden are going to tell you about. And that's what we mean when we say reading is parasitic on language, but that's not the whole story. We know that dyslexia occurs as part of a natural, unbroken continuum of ability, that what causes good reading also causes poor reading. The attributes of dyslexia are dimensional. We're not talking about categories. We're talking about normally distributed abilities in our population, and that's been very important for the science of dyslexia because we only need one theory to explain how some people learn to read and why some people fail. There's no such thing as a separate theory of dyslexia, and it doesn't require a separate theory. This has been very important for studies of brain function and genetics because it shows that these are heritable traits that are normally distributed in our population, and the corollary of that is that dyslexia, like attention deficit disorder, is a variation on normal development. So what's the prevalence? Well, you hear all kinds of numbers, but because it's a normalized continuum, prevalence is always relative to the threshold that you choose to use. So we can use terms like 1 in 5 children are dyslexic, but all that really means is that we've adopted a threshold around the 20th percentile for severity of the reading problem. If you want to get a real handle on the prevalence, look at most estimates, which are around 3 to 7%. They often assume effective intervention, absence of poverty and things of that sort, no comorbidity, but it always depends on the threshold. And what I point to when somebody asks me about prevalence is the meta-analysis by Maggie Snowling, where she combined studies that looked at family risk, families that had a sibling or parents with dyslexia, and if family risk was positive, and you took a threshold of the 10th percentile for poor reading, she found that the prevalence in these samples was 34%. In other words, I set the threshold at 10%, but because of familial risk, the prevalence in families with positive family histories is 34%, and if I kick it up above the 10th percentile, it's 53%. It was 45% overall. If I go to families and I look at studies where there's no family history, and I set the threshold at the 10th percentile, the prevalence was 11%. Exactly what you would expect based on a multivariate normal distribution. If I set it at the 10th percentile, above the 10th percentile, where it could be anywhere from the 10th to the 30th percentile, she gets an average of 16%. So it's always relative, and the correct answer to the prevalence question is how many would you like? IQ is a red herring. We pay a lot of attention to IQ. For a few kids, it's a very important question, but for most kids, depending on how you define it, IQ is not a relevant variable. Dyslexia really should be identified through assessments of reading and spelling and instructional response. Short, targeted assessments that are directly linked to performance and lead directly to intervention. IQ tests are not necessary. Dyslexia is uncoupled from IQ, not strongly related. Methods for identification of learning disabilities based on IQ discrepancy or patterns of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, which suck money from funds that schools have to deliver intervention, are not necessary. We need to treat and test, not test and treat. Children do not outgrow dyslexia. Over 70% of children identified as dyslexic in grade 3 remain dyslexic as adults without adequate intervention. Dyslexia is a lifelong chronic disorder. IQ is weakly related to intervention outcomes and long-term development. This is from Sally Shaywitz's work in the Connecticut Longitudinal Project. It has kids were identified with dyslexia in the 3rd grade here. She had reading tests on them all the way to the end of high school. There are 2 groups of poor readers here. One meets IQ discrepancy criteria. The other are simply kids who don't read well but are not intellectually disabled. The average IQ score of this group is 108. The average IQ of this group is 92. That's a 16-point difference. Notice that there's not a bit of difference in the long-term development of reading skills. And what you have is growth to a plateau over time. These are typical readers here. They also grow to a plateau. So there's no catching up, there's no acceleration, even though over half these kids were identified for special education by the 6th grade. People with dyslexia have problems outside phonology. It's not the only problem they have. We use the term comorbid because typically when this happens, it means the child has more than one problem. It's not the dyslexia causing these problems. And that might involve other academics, like areas like math. It certainly involves attention deficit disorder. And when you have a child that has both dyslexia and attention disorder, it is imperative that both components be treated. We actually have a clinical trial that just came out that was funded by NICHD that shows very clearly that you get better outcomes, particularly for fluency and comprehension, in comorbid kids who get both reading intervention and medication treatment. And certainly word recognition is not the only type of reading disability, but text-level disorder should not be considered dyslexic. Dyslexia, and that's important because a lot of people define dyslexia as a text-level disorder in research, and then you start getting weird findings. But dyslexia is real. The consensus definition that I showed you is very narrow. It focuses very specifically on the key phenotypic characteristic, which is word reading and spelling, and that's because dyslexia is often part of a complex presentation. The continuity hypothesis, advanced out of behavioral genetics research, has shown that there are generalist genes that affect reading, ADHD, and math. They have this in common. We know at a neural level that there is overlap in the areas that are involved in reading, attention, and in math. We don't understand what this overlap means, but we know that there's overlap. And we know that the attributes in these disorders are correlated. What's important from a treatment point of view is that you have to identify them and develop a comprehensive treatment plan that addresses them. ADHD is common. If language and working memory problems are significant, math will be impaired. In kids who aren't learning to read, anxiety is common in as much as 25% of the population. My colleague Sharon Vaughn and Amy Grills just started a clinical trial in which they're introducing anxiety interventions for 1st graders who aren't responding well to intervention. Written expression and reading comprehension are almost always impaired, but this phonological processing word reading link shines through the glare of all this complexity. And this just shows you very quickly sort of how significant this is. These are kids that have dyslexia, a reading disability, a math disability. They have no comorbidity, no attention deficit disorder. And I defined them using IQ and achievement tests. I gave them cognitive measures of sustained attention, problem solving, concept formation, phonological awareness here. What I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the reading disability group here actually does have a strength in procedural learning. If you know anything about people with dyslexia, they're really good at figuring out things that they see, doing problem solving, if they don't have ADHD. But notice this profound impairment in phonological awareness and how we have all these skills here that don't differentiate, like rapid naming, kids with reading disability and math disability. But 3 distinct patterns. These are different kinds of learning disability. The most striking evidence for the validity of the concept of a learning disability is that I need different interventions for these kids. I will not help children with dyslexia by putting them in a math intervention. That may seem trivial, but that's an aptitude by treatment interaction, and it supports the validity of the concept of learning disability. Now, if I go through and I take my reading disability group and I divide them into those that meet the IQ achievement discrepancy group and those that are simply poor readers, notice that the difference is very small. It's only 0.3 of a standard deviation, despite the fact that they differ in IQ by a full standard deviation. And notice here that there is no difference in the two skills that are most strongly related to word reading, phonological awareness and rapid naming. No difference whatsoever. But if I go in and I add ADHD as a comorbid condition here, notice that it's the kids with comorbid problems that have the really significant problems with cognitive attention, sustained attention here. These kids, not these kids here that just have ADHD, but notice how both the comorbid group with both reading disability and ADHD and the group that just has dyslexia here, notice how similar they are in the characteristics of the reading problem. This is a more severe problem here. So dyslexia can be prevented in many cases. Remediation, and I'm making a very clear distinction between early intervention and remediation. Early intervention is when we screen. We don't make a diagnosis. We simply say the child's at risk. Let's see how much progress we can make in kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2. Once we get to grade 3, we're in a remedial situation. And once we're in a remedial situation, it takes much more intensity to address. But the skills that prevent dyslexia have to be taught early in school, not because there's a critical period, but because kids need and benefit differentially from the experience of reading. Remediation after grade 2 is demonstrably less effective, both in the classroom through Carol Connor's studies and through the remedial studies of Maureen Levette. It is diminishing returns. And no matter how intense you make it, if you don't have access to print early in your development, it's just hard to catch up. And we know and have known for many years that some children are placed in special education. They are instructional casualties because they did not get the needed instruction early in development. Dyslexia or any kind of learning disability should not be identified in the absence of documentation of adequate instruction, which is inherent in IDEA 2004, the special education legislation. But on the other hand, if you go through and you get effective intervention, there will still be kids who don't learn to read. They need adjuncts, accommodations, technology. We know very little about the efficacy of these kinds of interventions and accommodations, although that's often the very first thing that we do. So think with me about what effective intervention looks like. We know this. Effective intervention for somebody with dyslexia teaches phonics explicitly. That's the key word. It absolutely teaches the alphabetic principle with an approach that includes comprehension and fluency components. In other words, it takes a comprehensive reading program. If your idea is to give the kid worksheets and teach them to sound out words, and you don't have them do it automatically, and you don't have them do it in text and practice it and get them engaged in literature, it's not going to work. Comprehensive programs work much better than programs that are sort of narrow. The National Reading Panel report was widely misinterpreted as a phonics first report, when in fact it was a report about the importance of explicit instruction for struggling readers. And then what you do is differentiate based on student needs. Carol Connor has published 7 large randomized trials in major journals, including Science, that shows that if you help teachers differentiate the amount of code-based instruction and the amount of meaning-based instruction in the classroom, she gets gains that are 4 times higher than if teachers don't get that type of help and don't get that support for small group instruction. There is no specificity of appropriate interventions for dyslexia once you get beyond those key factors: explicit, comprehensive, differentiated at classroom and supplemental level. Research does not support these adjectives, multisensory in the traditional sense. The idea that we need to identify people with dyslexia so that we can give them multisensory instruction is not supported by research. What's important is explicit, comprehensive, differentiated. Terms like balance, systematic, manualized, multiple cueing systems, discovery or constructionist or rule-based approaches, no support. And traditional service delivery models are ineffective. What we should be doing is screening, preventing, remediating, and accommodating through a multi-tiered system of supports, which is in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In fact, what we do is just the opposite. We accommodate, remediate, because we haven't taken the opportunity to screen and prevent. So this is what it looks like. If we identify kids for special education in the 3rd grade, kids in this particular study made on average 0.04 standard deviations gain over 4 years they're in special education. So if you start special education with dyslexia and you have a reading quotient of 70, which is the 2nd percentile, 4 years later on age-adjusted scores, you'll be at the 3rd percentile. Now this is not trivial. This is what special education does. It stabilizes reading skills. It doesn't do a very good job of accelerating for reasons that we can all talk about, but it has a lot to do with the burdens that people put on special education. Now what's underlying here, if we put growth up here and just look at raw scores, we would see comparable patterns of growth, but because growth is not accelerated, what we see is stabilization here. Now, what we know in contrast is early intervention is effective. We know that 70 to 90% of at-risk children, who represent the bottom 20% in kindergarten and grade 2, can learn to read in the average range, and that when we do this, it prevents the automaticity problems that plague kids with dyslexia throughout their development. But reading is not a solution, remediation is not a solution. Decoding itself is usually teachable at any age with sufficient intensity, but reading rate is not, and reading rate is limited because when kids can't access print, they do not get enough exposure to print to develop a sight word repertoire. The ventral systems in the brain do not get the experience that they need, so they can sound out the word, but they don't have the sight word repertoire in the visual word form area that's needed to make reading an automatic skill. So the question is, how do you close the gap with a student who's already 3 to 5 years behind? And I'm talking about exposure and experience, not age. So I'm going to wrap up by talking just briefly about our NSF study, which seems appropriate in this context. This was a study of early reading intervention. The program officer was John Chernavsky. We did this as part of the Interagency Educational Research Initiative. We provided an early reading intervention and did some brain imaging. And basically, we screened the entire 1st grade classroom, the bottom 20%. The district provided extensive professional development and materials. We did progress monitoring, and then we gave some children an additional 40 minutes of daily small group instruction for about 30 weeks, about 80 hours total. 2 different kinds of pedagogical intervention. One is a scripted, prescriptive program that we call proactive intervention that had explicit instruction in synthetic phonics. It integrated decoding fluency and comprehension strategies, had 100% decodable text, a carefully constructed scope and sequence designed to prevent possible confusions that were taught to mastery. The other intervention taught reading in the context of reading and writing. It used the alphabetic principle, fluency, and comprehension strategies, had no scope and sequence. Teachers responded to the student needs as they were observed, and it used level text, not phonetically decodable text. These are the results. What you can see, these are kids that are typically developing. These are kids who only got classroom instruction. They're the control group. These kids got the extra supplemental instruction. You can see on this fluency graph over time that there's no difference between the 2 interventions, but by the end of the intervention, these kids are doing much better. In fact, If all we did is to enhance core classroom instruction, like through a program that Carol Connor does, there were 15 kids out of 92 that got the intervention that were not meeting benchmarks at the end of the year. That is 16% of this group, but that translates, since this is the bottom 20%, we have reduced the number of kids that are at risk from 20% to 3.2%. If they got tutoring, 163 kids finished the intervention, 7 did not meet benchmarks. That's 4%. That's less than 1% of the school population. We have had a significant impact on the number of kids with foundational level skilled deficits, and they can understand what they read. The brain changes in development. This is a typically developing kid. This is a dorsal reading system here. Here's the ventral system that John and Guinevere will tell you about. Through development, this has been created. You can see these changes from end of kindergarten to end of grade 1 in kids who responded, and this is kids who don't respond. Okay, I know. It's okay, I'm about done. We then gave the kids a tier 3 intervention here, and you can see individual differences in how well the children responded to this very intense 16-week intervention. And then Carolyn Ditton scaled this up through the IERI and handed it off. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to show you my last slide, which is here, except I lost it. And the last slide is by Alvin Lieberman, who said that we are all born with dyslexia. The difference is that some of us are easy to cure and some of us are not. Thank you very much. I'm glad to take questions. In the back.
Could you explain a little more about your thoughts that multisensory systems interventions do not work? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, what works are structured language interventions, which is what a lot of the traditional multisensory interventions have transformed into. But the idea that interventions are only effective if they have a multisensory component. And I'm talking about very traditional multisensory components like crossing the midline or teaching to auditory and visual skills simultaneously. People have manipulated that and they haven't found that to be an important component. It's really about language and print, not about the multisensory component. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I have a question. You were talking about dyslexia being a problem with words in isolation in particular.
Yes.
What about, or are there students who are pretty good with words in isolation and spelling, and they're not so good with fluency, and schools like emphasize fluency constantly, like they have to do a lot of oral reading, but there might be some kids that, they're pretty good at decoding, it's just they don't do so well on the dibbles, those time fluency measures.
Yeah, that's an automaticity problem. It's usually an outgrowth of an earlier decoding problem. It doesn't usually occur in isolation. In languages that are more transparent, those types of problems predominate.
So, but that wouldn't be dyslexia, right?
It just depends on the child's history and whether they had a foundational problem earlier. But it is an impairment in a foundational skill. Okay, thank you very much.